Okie.
Check, check.
You're live. Hi, Dean.
Hi,
How are you?
good.
Good. Turn on your mic.
It's on. Okay.
All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Clean Resource Innovation Network event. My name is Nan Ho Covington, and I'm honored to be your moderator for today's gathering. We have a small and mighty team in person, and I think we have a few people online. Shimmer, I know you're online, and I'm calling you out because you and I have known each other for a long time. So as you may know, the Clean Resource Innovation Network is a pan-Canadian network dedicated to fostering innovation and collaboration for a cleaner energy future. By bringing together industry leaders, entrepreneurs, researchers, and policymakers, CRIN is driving the development and adoption of technologies that improve environmental and economic performance across Canada and beyond. Today's event, part of the Digital C3 series, Collaboration, Conversation, and Connection, focuses on navigating the complexities of regulations in an era of policy uncertainty. With the introduction of Bill C-59, which addresses issues with anti-greenwashing and compliance, organizations in the clean tech space have had to face new challenges and opportunities. This session is designed to provide actionable insights into how we can adapt to these evolving regulatory landscapes while maintaining transparency and fostering innovation. We are fortunate today to have Dean Lancaster with us. So Dean is joining us today from PwC Canada. He is a director of data and AI, of the data and AI practice. So with over 15 years of experience spanning the UK and Canada. So you may notice a slight accent.
Just a slight accent,
Just
yeah.
a slight accent.
Trying to lose it, not working.
Okay, well, I lost mine, but I've been here for like 55 years.
There you go. There is hope.
There's you have hope. Anyway, Dean specializes in helping public and private sector clients unlock the value of data while managing risk and compliance. Dean's expertise lies in responsible AI, regulatory data use, and transparency, making him a key voice in discussions about navigating regulatory challenges in the digital age. So as we dive into today's session, I encourage you to engage fully, ask questions, and embrace the collaborative spirit that defines CRIN. Today, we can turn challenges into opportunities and pave the way for a sustainable and resilient future. But before I turn the mic over to Dean, a couple of housekeeping things. Questions. If you have questions, feel free to interrupt along the way. Dean's happy to take questions during his presentation. And if you're online, please ask questions through the Q&A portion and not through the chat so that we can monitor that properly. And then if you're in person, if you want to ask a question, wait till Amber brings over the mic to you, and that way we can actually catch your voice and that's transmitted on a hybrid situation. So we have over 75 people registered today. And so as you can see by in person, most people are online. So take it away, Dean.
Thank you so much, Nan. And a big thank you for having me here today. Very, very excited to cover a topic which is near and dear to my heart. As Nan says, would like to make this as interactive as possible because I think most people find this quite a dry subject. So, you know, if we can make it a bit more exciting, I think that's going to benefit us all. As Nan says, my name is Dean Lancaster, and I've been working in this area now for almost 20 years, between 15 and 20 years, across a wide variety of industries, really following the curve of adoption. So retail, then financial services, then public sector, and then finally UMI. What we're going to cover today is some of the regulatory guidelines impacting our industry, both within Canada and internationally. We're going to look at some relevant political and legal implications, particularly with the change in US administration and an incoming, what I would call an America First set of policies. We're going to look at some lessons learned, so both in terms of successes and what can go wrong if we don't properly govern data. I'm going to give some tangible recommendations for you to take away. And then finally, we're going to leave some time for questions and answers. Okay. Okay, so let's dive in. Gonna start by asking ourselves a question which I ask myself regularly, why data governance matters. And there are really three main drivers for implementing strong data governance. The first is data is a strategic asset. So it has value and it carries risk. You wouldn't be cavalier about your physical assets, and now's the time to think similarly about your digital assets, including data. Second kind of key driver here that I want to call out is it can improve decisions and efficiency. So as with any asset, the value and risk is really intertwined with how you use and protect this asset. Poor data governance can lead to expensive mistakes, and good data governance can lead to improvements in profitability. A good example here, and as I say, we will look at in depth at a few examples towards the end of the discussion, is one oil company really managed to improve their margins by 12 to 15% after integrating high value data sources across the business. So, when you think about margins, that's pretty significant. Third driver I want to touch on is we can't really think of data as an IT responsibility anymore. Traditionally that was the way we thought of it, like a lot of IT applications, but the risk here is too great. Weak governance can lead to safety incidents and regulatory fines. So it's really becoming a business imperative for resiliency and competitiveness. Okay. Now that we understand some of the main drivers, I'm going to turn our attention to some of the regulatory guidelines. We're going to start locally, looking at the guidelines in Alberta, move out to the federal lens, and then we're going to look more globally, what the guidelines look like. Okay. Canada and Alberta specifically have what I would call reasonably strong and consistent privacy laws. In Alberta, we have something called CPPA. We're expecting that to be updated this June. At the federal level, we have something called CPPA, which is like CPPA in that it requires organizations to safeguard personal information. Also like CPPA, it's under modernization. So there's a bill which kind of floats in and out of Parliament right now. It's currently in a bit of a holding stage called Bill C-27, also known as the Digital Charter Rights Act. And that's really the equivalent to the modernizations that we're seeing to CPPA. I say that we have reasonably strong guidelines and regulations because they aren't as stringent as some of the guidelines that we see globally. In Europe, they have something called GDPR. In California, they have the CPRA. Bill C-27 is more at a parity with those, a little bit more robust than what we have under CPPA. There isn't really any blank data localization requirements within Canada today, except for certain provinces. And what I mean by this is we're pretty free within a lot of the provinces in Canada to move data outside of the province, outside of country, if there's a reason to do so. There are some exceptions to that, excuse me, such as BC. BC actually mandates that their public sector data stays within province. Nova Scotia has a similar guideline. But these aren't the only laws to be concerned about. There are other regulations, such as industry-specific regulations. So I'm sure many of you know the Alberta Energy Regulator. They require detailed data reporting on safety and emissions. And even within our federal government, things like the Income Tax Act, it requires maintenance of certain records within Canada. So you're not allowed to store those outside of Canada. So it's even within Canada, it's kind of a bit of a patchwork quilt today. Now, internationally, as we would expect, things get more complex. I'm going to talk a little bit about navigating the sorry, I had a few problems with the clicker there. I'm going to talk a little bit about navigating what I call the Texas-Alberta corridor, which is a corridor we all kind of work in. And again, there's kind of a patchwork quilt of regulations here. Each state has either its own or no specific privacy laws. Texas has recently joined 10 other states in adopting a comprehensive privacy statute. And one approach to handling this is to adopt the most restrictive guidelines based in the jurisdictions that you operate. not necessarily the only way of doing this, but it's kind of a fail-safe way of doing this. I need to talk about the Trump administration. It's unknown really what's going to happen there yet across many different areas. Working with data is just one of those areas. What we suspect is going to happen here is this may tilt towards deregulation and America First policies around data. And what that could mean is that we see looser federal oversight on privacy and environmental reporting. That provides a risk to the work we do with data in that it creates a regulatory divergence. It's likely that we're going to see a tightening of laws in Canada, where we're going to see a loosening of laws in the US. Now, that may create some opportunities, right? So we may be able to process data in regions with looser laws, but it's more likely to create complexities for our organizations. Really, the message here is staying agile and informed is key. Sorry, Nan, go ahead.
Sorry, Dean. I've just noticed there's been a couple pieces that have come out through social media around disclosure, and that some are backing off from, or financial institutions backing off from reporting. That's going to have an impact, won't it?
Oh, absolutely, yes. Yes, it will. We see that both in terms of kind of financial institutions backing out of reporting, but also, and we'll touch on this in a little while now, there's becoming this tension between who has access to the data. Within Canada, we're seeing tension at the federal versus provincial level. Globally, we're seeing that tension. I'm going to talk a little bit about this as well, but there's an act in the US called the US Cloud Act. And essentially what this means is that even if you're storing data in Canada, it could still be subject to exposure to US authorities because the parent company is based in the US. So it's getting very complex. There's almost a bit of a land grab right now in terms of who has access to data, who has jurisdiction over data. So, this kind of loosening of regulations, this regulatory divergence, it could create challenges around data residency and sovereignty. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So in terms of data sovereignty, cross-border storage creates issues, right? So if we're operating across the US and Canada, maybe the US, Canada, the UK, and Europe, we can run into all sorts of issues. So for example, if Canadian personal records are stored on a server in Houston, which laws apply? Is it the Canadian laws that apply because we're dealing with Canadian citizens and Canadian business? Or is it the American laws that apply because it's being stored in Houston? American public cloud providers, so that's Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud, and Microsoft Azure. They do offer regions in Canada, which mitigates some of the risk of storing data in the cloud and exposing it to US oversight. As I've said, though, that may not fully protect alignment with Canadian privacy expectations because this US Cloud Act can compel US providers to hand over data to government bodies, even when data is stored outside the US. There are some approaches to dealing with that. I do have an in-depth article on that on my LinkedIn, which I wrote a few weeks ago, talking about how we can mitigate some of those risks. One of the main ways is to use what we call sovereign clouds. Microsoft has something called a sovereign cloud in Europe right now. And what that does is the cloud is actually managed by a European company, which isn't part of Microsoft. And Microsoft licenses their IP to this company to stand up the same sort of services. So there are ways to address this. The final thing I wanted to talk about here is the USMCA. The USMCA, it really encourages the free flow of data across borders, which is a good thing. The bad thing here is that organizations can't really rely on localization for compliance. Bottom line is we need to ensure that governance and security travel with the data, okay? I'm now going to turn our attention to taking a look at some other political and ownership considerations. Before I do that, though, are there any questions on any of this? No? Okay. Okay. So first of all, I wanted to talk a little bit about data ownership. So while companies typically do own their operational data, as we've said, governments do require disclosure of certain data. So the Alberta Energy Regulator, for example, and the Canada Revenue Agency. Tensions are really starting to arise between protecting corporate IP and meeting regulatory demands. And embedding proper data governance can mitigate these tensions, really by ensuring that only the necessary and appropriately obfuscated data is shared. So, let's say you have poor data governance and you need to produce a report for a regulator. You might be tempted just to dump a data set into a report and send it off to the regulator, right? If you have good data governance, you can quickly identify exactly what the regulator is looking for, and you can provide that data, but with fields obfuscated, with fields removed, where it's appropriate to do so. So you're reducing your risk and you're protecting your IP. In terms of residency and jurisdiction, as we've said, the location of stored data typically determines its legal jurisdictions. There are some exceptions to that, such as the US Cloud Act. And certain providers are starting to address this. Sovereign clouds is one, providing enhanced encryption is another way of approaching this. So, if you're storing data with a US cloud provider, make sure that you encrypt all of your highly sensitive data. And then if the cloud provider is compelled to hand over that data to a US authority, all they're going to get is the ciphertext. They're not going to get the clear text data. They're not going to make any sense of it. And there's ways of architecting it to make that sync. As I say, unfortunately, these sovereign clouds don't exist in Canada yet. Bill C-27 may push the needle on that. GDPR did in Europe. But Microsoft are really the only one of the big three that are taking this that seriously today and really meeting their customers where the risks exist. As I've said, certain Canadian jurisdictions are leaning in towards mandating data residency. Alberta is not one of those provinces. The two that are BC and Nova Scotia, but it's primarily for public sector data. And, I do a lot of work in the public sector as well, and I can tell you there's still some issues to resolve there, such as, using a US provider with a Canadian region may not be sufficient. In terms of sovereignty, there is an increase in political tensions, as we've mentioned, between the federal, provincial, national, and international governments over data collection. An example of this quite recently is our recent pushback in Alberta on federal data collection. This really highlights those issues, especially when we consider the impact on national resources. Now, in terms of politics, as we touched on the previous slide, there's been a big change in the administration in the US. That's really likely to generate what I call regulatory divergence. So Canada's tightening its privacy laws, right? We're moving towards a model more like the European model. It's likely that the US is going to loosen its privacy laws, right? Or at least at the federal level. You are seeing this adoption of privacy laws at the state level, but at the federal level, it's likely to continue loosening. This is going to create regulatory divergence. Proactive management is key, right? So, if you don't proactively manage this, you could run into operational disruptions. You could find yourself out of compliance, right? So it's really important that we understand that divergence as it happens. Key takeaway here, clearly defined data residency policies and really staying agile and informed. It's critical to minimizing risk and maintaining operational continuity. Okay. If there's no more questions on this slide, I'm going to turn us over now to look at some real world examples. Okay. So I've got 3 examples to discuss with everyone today. 2 are successes and 1 is a failure. I always like to bring through the successes first of all, because it's nice to see who we could be, but just a little failure at the end, just to scare you guys a little bit, but in all seriousness, this is serious stuff, and these type of things can happen if you don't manage your data appropriately. The first case study I wanted to talk about is Laredo Petroleum. I'm sure many folks are familiar with Laredo. They're a mid-sized US-based oil producer. They recently revamped their data architecture by migrating to a governed cloud platform. And so far, they've managed to save $100,000 through eliminating the legacy infrastructure. Now, that's nice, but it's not going to meaningfully change the business. What is potentially going to meaningfully change the business over time is an additional $60,000 a month gain through operational efficiencies and cost savings. And that's just in the infancy, right, of adopting this technology. We expect those cost savings and operational efficiencies to improve over time. An even better outcome is Laredo's teams have sped up reporting and analytics, and they've used these to identify optimization opportunities. So things like predictive maintenance and demand planning, they're now much more easy and feasible for the organization to perform. Key takeaway here is investment in modern data governance can provide not only compliance, but quick financial wins, right? Real dollars and cents impacts. Okay. Second case study I wanted to quickly look at is the Open Subsurface Data Universe, OSDU. And this is a consortium-based approach that was adopted by Shell, Chevron, and Equinor as a common standard for subsurface production data. And really what it does is it standardizes data collection and governance across the enterprise to facilitate easier interoperability, reduce duplication, and reduce uncertainty. Now, this is kind of in its infancy, to be honest, and Shell are the only organization to really report so far on the benefits, as is fairly typical of Shell. They're kind of ahead of the game here, but they are seeing faster setup of analytics and AI programs and easier data sharing amongst global teams. Key takeaway here is industry collaboration can really drive innovation and efficiency across the sector. Finally, I wanted to talk to an example of a failure here. Talking about BP Deepwater Horizon, the Macondo blowout. Probably don't need to explain what happened here, but did you guys know this was due to data governance issues, right? Investigations found that critical test data was not shared effectively and it was misinterpreted, which is super common when you have a whole ton of data points and you don't know which ones are the authoritative ones. You don't know which ones you can rely on to make decisions. Now, in the final hours, anomalous pressure readings were overlooked, and this really led to a huge blowout. So, lesson to take away from this is that all the sensor data in the world is useless if you don't have the proper governance to share it with the right people at the right time. Okay. Now, before we move on to some recommendations, we're almost at the end of kind of the core presentation part here. Wanted to leave you with a few recommendations before we open the floor to discussions. Before I do that, though, are there any questions on any of this? Okay, this really is a dry topic, eh? Very interesting. Thanks, Nan. Okay. So I've got two clickers here, so I'm going to click through on both of them. So I'm going to talk really through 7 recommendations today, which I found in my experience are really key to enabling good data governance and driving a lot of benefits here. First recommendation, and this is probably the most important first step, is to implement a clear data governance framework. So what does this mean? It means define the roles, the processes, and the technical capabilities to operationalize data governance. I come from a tech background, but I'll tell you guys for free, the technology is 20% of the solution here. Most of the solution is ensuring that you have the right bums in the right seats, right? The right roles and responsibilities. and you have the right processes when you're working with data, when you're sharing data, when you're bringing data into the business. Second thing, which is really important when developing the framework, is to gain strong executive sponsorship across all major business units and organizational functions. As I mentioned earlier on, traditionally this has been an IT-led initiative. That does not work anymore, right? The use of data has proliferated far outside of IT into, pretty much every BU around the organization. So, having the right folks responsible for governance activities within the different functions is really key. And getting that buy-in requires that executive sponsorship. Second recommendation I have is to prioritize compliance and regulatory awareness. So, regularly audit your practices versus the regulatory guidelines. And within those regulatory guidelines, proactively monitor for changes. So, for instance, these 10 states across the US, including Texas, which were adopting, more robust privacy statutes, make sure you're aware of that. Make sure that you're ahead of the curve and you're adopting your use of data to address those new guidelines. Third recommendation I wanted to talk about is to develop a data residency strategy. So clearly define where different types of data can or should be stored. Maintain data sovereignty, right? So as we've mentioned, using a Canadian data region is a great first step, but it's not a panacea, right? In the light of, the US Cloud Act and other America First regulations that we're seeing coming down the pipeline. Implement contractual provisions. So when you're working with organizations such as Azure and AWS and GCP, make sure that you're putting the contractual provisions necessary in those contracts to protect your assets, right? Finally, take other mitigations for highly sensitive data, right? So when you're building out your data governance, make sure that you're classifying your data from, super high risk to, very low risk if it becomes public. For that super high risk data, whether it's encryption keys, whether it's PI, whether it's, IP operational data, which is, critical and a competitive advantage for your business, either store it locally, right? Or make sure that you're encrypting it if you are storing it in the public cloud. And you're keeping those keys to de-encrypt it in a secure vault on site, right? So that even if someone gets access to that, they don't get access to the actual data. Fourth recommendation I wanted to touch on is to invest in improving data quality and accessibility. So, I've said that technology is only kind of 20% of the solution here. I do believe it's important to invest in modern data cataloging and management. That should be really a fast follow from when you've developed your processes and roles and responsibilities, because it's going to enable you to automate those processes and scale them across the business while still maintaining your compliance. Also, through improving your data quality and accessibility, you're really able to unlock value. So we often think of data governance as a stick. It's a compliance activity. It's a cost center. It's not something we want to do. But if we do this right, data governance can be the vehicle through which you deliver your data strategy. It can unlock value, it can create efficiencies, and it can generate net new revenue through optimization. So make sure that you're really, on top of the benefits that data governance can bring, and use that as a selling point to encourage adoption throughout the organization. Okay. One second.
We have a question from online.
Okay, sure.
Can you please share your crystal ball thoughts about where this data governance journey is going, say in 2 and 5 year time?
Of course. So my crystal ball thoughts here is, I've been in this industry a long time. I don't know if anyone's old enough here to remember when we used to not have email in organizations. And, my email might be present on a few people. And, the emails were like numbers of Sorry, I think my mic was cutting out, but I think I'm okay. I think I'm okay now. I can really see the same happening with data, right? Like now we can't imagine working without email and modern communication tools. And, you know, data governance and modern data management is really going to democratize and put data on everybody's desk. I really see a future, and I've actually implemented this in a few of my clients where we don't need a ton of data scientists anymore, right? Working with data is fully automated. Any business user can build a predictive model and deploy it to production and have confidence that they've used the data appropriately, that the model's sound and ethical, and not biased, and they can then have confidence that they're going to deploy it and work with it within the risk management of the organization. So what I really see happening is guidelines, regulatory guidelines becoming more robust. That's going to really force us to think about how we're working with data. The other side of the coin is in order to achieve those guidelines, we're going to need to embed a lot more automation. That automation is going to open up the door to making data much more of a commoditized service for all business users. Okay. So moving on to the last three sort of recommendations here. Leverage industry standards and collaboration, right? So we've seen with the example of the OSDU, this participation in industry forums, it really allows us to share best practices and open up new opportunities for collaboration. That's really key for achieving a lot of the benefits here and not reinventing the wheel every time, right? Build a data-driven culture. So this is kind of a fluffy one, but it's key to good governance. As I've said, this can no longer be an IT-centric responsibility. We need to make this everyone's responsibility. And this really comes back to my first recommendation around deploying a robust data governance framework. Get the executive sponsorship. I'd like to see all of the C-suite align that this is something that we need to work towards. All of the BU leadership and functional leadership align that this is something that's going to drive value and that everyone has a responsibility in protecting their data.
So, Dean, getting C-suite aligned is a bit tougher.
Yep.
And there's more regulatory requirements now to make sure the C-suite is aligned because there's potential penalties, correct?
Correct. Yep.
So how do you accelerate that? Or do you have suggestions how do we accelerate our C-suite to come on board and be aligned on a strategy?
Yeah, I do. So, I talk a lot about the carrot and the stick. Certain C-suite folks are going to be more interested in the stick. So risk management, privacy, legal, don't want to end up in hot water. That's great. Other C-suite folks are going to be less interested in the stick because they think the possibility for getting fined for this type of stuff is quite low. And God bless them, they're right. Like under PPPA, your chance of being fined for this stuff is quite low. But that's changing rapidly, right? Like if we look at GDPR, the fines for that, I think, are 3% of net revenue, something like that, if you get a violation. Bill C-27 isn't finalized yet. I don't think it's going to have quite the teeth of GDPR, but the fines could be significant. So I think it's really important to also have the carrot. So when you're dealing with, operations, marketing, product development, all that sort of stuff, we really need to be showing them the benefits of being able to unlock the value of their data through good data governance, through automation.
And so this week I was just chatting with someone about C26. And
Yeah.
so I know we're going to uncover more at the next session on May 21st. And we're going to talk more about C26 and cybersecurity. And so I saw a snippet out of there, and it's almost $1 million fine for C-suite and $15 million corporate if you don't comply with those rules and regulations, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
It's getting pretty messy.
Could get pretty expensive. And, C26 is an interesting one because it's, that's more to do with, well, here's the way I look at it, right? Bill C-26 tells us to lock the doors, right? Lock everything down, keep your organization secure. Bill C-27 tells us to mind what we do inside, right? So once we've locked the doors, what do we do inside our organization? And obviously, you know, I shouldn't say obviously, but I think it's a greater imperative to ensure that the data remains within the business and isn't exposed to goodness knows who. But once you have that data, it's still vitally important that you treat it in the right way. So I think Bill C-27 will have lower fines. I think Papidia is 100,000 per incident right now. I think it'll be somewhere between the two. But yeah, there's still significant financial penalties. Yeah. Okay. So the last recommendation I wanted to just touch on here was around measurable value. So, you know, I've said this, but when you're dealing with the C-suite, when you're dealing with business unit leads, when you're dealing with, you know, folks on the ground that are actually doing their day-to-day job, use this idea of the carrot and the stick, right? So, you know, use governance really as a tool to encourage data use and create value. Highlight successes, right? So within your data governance operating model, make sure there's a mechanism to highlight successes and set those measurable goals so you can understand when you are successful. Just to wrap this up, this presentation, because this is my last slide. The bottom line here is that, you know, committing today to see the tangible benefits tomorrow. Don't let your competitors achieve an advantage in the market by doing this type of stuff before you do. Because if they have the right data governance in place, that's going to unlock many opportunities for working with data, whether that be cross-border between the US and Canada, whether it's within your organization, within Canada. Don't let them achieve, you know, an advantage in the market through being able to work with data more effectively. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, folks. There's not that many in the room, so that was a good applause.
We're setting up for a quick conversation so that Dean and I can go through a few questions. Do you have,
Yep.
There you go.
Yeah,
This is how you
if
find
anyone
Dean
wants to
afterwards.
contact me, yeah, feel free to reach out. And
416.
don't hold that against me. I've lived in Calgary for many years. It just, someone told me these 416 numbers are going to be worth some money someday. So I was like, I'm going to keep it because they're like gold to get now.
Well, Dean, happy to have you join me here.
Oh, my pleasure.
Any questions from our audience so far or online or any additional ones? Nothing. Okay, well, I have a few for you, Dean.
Sure.
You ready to go?
I'm ready.
Okay, so we've talked about all these different challenges, and I want to just dig a little further into what are the biggest challenges businesses face in navigating these new regulations? Like, what's the call to action for that?
So, you know, Nan, we've talked about regulatory divergence between the US and Canada, and we've talked about the global landscape. But even within Canada, we're seeing what I would call scope creep and overlap. So, you know, Quebec has Law 25. Fortunately, there's not a ton of, you know, oil and gas operations in Quebec. So, but in terms of, you know, mining and renewables and stuff, there is quite a lot of development there. So being able to understand the overlap is going to be important. Second thing I'd say is the timings are unknown, right? So C26 and C27, the introduction dates are still very fluid. I've been saying to my clients for probably the last 3-4 years, you know, Bill C27 is coming, and I'm just looking like a fool right now because it keeps getting pushed out. But you know, such is the nature of our government, I suppose. That's really making investment planning tricky. But you know, if you focus on the value more than the compliance, I think you can make the case for investment today. Third thing I'll point out is there is a resource squeeze. So if any of you have looked for data governance talent in the market, as I have to do regularly, trying to find those folks is incredibly difficult, and I'm seeing a lot of poaching. It's really hard to find qualified people. You know, and finally, supply chain exposure. You know, operators must vouch for vendors' controls as well and how they handle data. Certainly that's an expectation coming out of Bill C-27.
Oh, yeah. Having worked for Spartan Controls for 30 years, leading sustainability, we get a lot of questionnaires, or I should say we had a lot of questionnaires, or I had to answer a lot of questionnaires with respect to the amount of effort and procedures and processes that we had to protect data that our customers were giving us, right?
Yeah.
And so, okay, I know you're being seen as a fool because you say it's coming, but I think we should look at it from a different way. And that it gives companies who actually haven't done anything yet an opportunity to get themselves ready. So
100%.
the election just happened. We'll see C-26 and C-27 coming out hopefully in the next 6 months or a year, or less than a year, probably.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
So it does give companies time now to just go, okay, what are we doing? What's our procedure and what's our process? And do we go ahead and comply to C-26 and C-27 and knowing that it's coming down the pipe? So, that leads to, how do we make sure organizations ensure that they remain competitive while complying with this evolving data privacy and cybersecurity laws?
That's a great question. And, I'd say, first of all, bake this in, right? Bake security by design, bake privacy by design into your product development. It's faster than retrofitting it, right? If you're deploying new ERP systems, new predictive maintenance systems and the like, bake it in when you're designing the system. Don't ignore it today to have to retrofit it afterwards. Second point I'd make is, map those data value streams, right? Keep only the data that you need to keep that drives an analytics advantage, and delete or anonymize the rest, right? Reduce your risk profile. Don't keep data around just for the sake of keeping data around. You're just increasing your risk. I would say use compliance programs to unlock global market access, right? So, use these programs as a vehicle to smooth the process for cross-border deals, faster vendor approvals. And finally, tell this story, right? Tell it to your investors. Do transparent ESG style cyber privacy reporting. That both attracts capital investment, but it also attracts, fresh talent into your business as well.
Yeah, talent development is key.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you have a question?
Thanks, Dean. I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more on the recommendation for building a data-driven culture. You had sort of mentioned data governance can no longer be within the IT department, and how you sort of navigate your clients from, disseminating governance throughout the organization.
It's a great question. So, when my clients are rolling out these data governance frameworks, they often look at this as a compliance activity, right? And it is a compliance activity, but that's only 50% of the value really that it can bring. I always recommend that my clients, for their various different business units and business functions, have both a data custodian and a data steward, right, within their governance model. And the difference between those two roles is a data custodian is responsible for compliance activities, right? So I didn't say this, and if I'm quizzed on it, are we recording this? We probably are, so I'm probably
We are
done.
recording this.
The boring stuff, right? So making sure that we're complying with the agreements through which the data was collected, whether that's a third-party agreement, whether it's your organizational privacy policy and you're collecting direct from customers, making sure that we're using the data for the reasons we said we were going to use it. That's the data custodian's job. The data steward, their job is solely to ensure the fitness of the data for business purposes, right? So these data stewards, they're working hand in hand with BU leaders, with operations staff, product development staff, etc., to really understand the business, to really understand that function's part in the overall organizational value chain, and understanding how to appropriately prepare and make available the data to support the optimization of that value chain, whether it will be through development of AI models for things like predictive maintenance, or whether it's just reporting on day-to-day activities to make operations in the field more efficient and generate operational efficiencies that way. Does that answer your question?
Does that lead into our next governance question?
I think it does.
It really does.
Like we planned it.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Woohoo, thank you. From your perspective, how can businesses establish robust governance frameworks to align with these new bills, C26 and 27?
That's another great question. And so, what I'm advising my clients to do today is to create one charter with two lenses, right? So have a single enterprise data and cyber charter with parallel control families. So, it might be for privacy, AI, and cyber, and use a risk classification matrix, right? So tag each of those systems and assets for criticality. So that would be to do with C26 and personal information / AI impact. So that would be for C27. When we're rolling these out, I recommend kind of 3 lines of accountability. Line 1 would be your product and operation owners. Line 2 would be an integrated data privacy security office, right? So they're all sitting in one.
Centralized.
Exactly, yeah. And line 3 is your internal audit, right? So with board level cyber privacy commitments, cyber and privacy committee responsibilities. The final thing I'll mention is generate what I call metrics that matter. I know that's a consultant blurb, but
Yeah.
I'm a consultant. So, MTTR, for instance, % of high-risk AI models with documented impacts assessments, privacy request SLAs, all of that stuff, right? And report on those back to the business.
And eventually we're going to have to report a lot of that back to government too, are we not?
Most likely,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it might be that we only have to report that if you get in trouble, but it's always good to be prepared.
Yeah, well, in cybersecurity, you have to report all your incidents. don't you?
Correct.
So,
Yeah,
and yeah, it's going to get ugly.
yeah.
Oh, acronym alert. Okay, go back to those acronyms.
Oh, yeah. So the mean time to resolution, MTTR. Sorry. As I said, I'm a consultant.
And I'm here to make sure we extract everything out of you.
Thank you, Nan. Someone needs to.
So, which again, we've got these questions that are leading into each other. How can organizations effectively manage their corporate data sets to ensure compliance on both privacy protection and cybersecurity regulations?
Another good question. I would say, one of the main things is to have a unified, what I call a single pane of glass. So have your metadata, your lineage, your retention and disposition policies, and your access controls all in one place. There's a lot of good tools out there that can do that today. So tools like Calibra, Elation, Atlan, they're great at this and at managing the workflows that sit behind all of that unified information. Second thing I would say is automate where possible. So automate your labeling and policy enforcement via things like integrated access management, Purview. There's tools like Ohalo, Data X-Ray, which can do this for unstructured data. And tie the sensitivity levels to your use of encryption and tokenization or quarantining data, right, when it's especially sensitive. As I've said, data minimization is really key, right? So only keep what you need to. Link the collection purpose to what is going to be the CPPA consent, but what would be consent under Bill C27, and set up processes to auto-delete orphan data or transient data, which shouldn't be kept because it was never kept. It was never defined to be kept for any length of time when it was collected.
Okay, CPPA.
The Canadian Privacy Protection Act, I think, is basically what Bill C27 is going to become.
Okay.
Yeah, they've changed the name. I think it's now the Digital Charter Rights Act. But the name's evolving as it goes forward.
Okay.
More acronyms.
More acronyms. And it's just hard to navigate even that.
Yeah.
Including, yeah. So what advice do you have, or did I cover this? What advice do you have for businesses that want to turn compliance into a strategic advantage rather than a hurdle?
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about this idea that data governance can make working with data easy. Those old Staples commercials where someone's pressed the easy button, right? Like data governance can really enable working with data in that sort of fashion. I think that's the main thing. But, some other important points to note here, sell trust, I've said that already, but publish your SOC 2, but also publish privacy reports, right? And that becomes a differentiator for talent, for attracting capital, also in business to business deals, right? Like, if you're working with suppliers and whatnot, they want to work with organizations that have got, their stuff together around working with data. They don't want to feel that their data is going to be at risk if they have to share, client information with you, etc. Leverage federal incentives. So, C26 may open future grant programs for cyber upgrades, budget relief, etc. Data monetization. So, Bill C27, it's really going to enshrine data portability and clarity. So, that really makes it easier for organizations to make consent something which they can engage their customers with and start to monetize some of their data in a safe, ethical, responsible way. And then, what I would say is shift those cost savings to the left, right? So early privacy and cyber gates, really, they cut the rework and breach costs. So, look at this as a way of avoiding future costs that you may incur if things go wrong, or you will incur them if things go wrong.
Hopefully nothing goes wrong, but
Nope, it's
hopefully,
not going to go wrong.
no. Speaking of nothing going wrong, do you have an example or a success story of a company that's, navigated the complex regulations somehow and are maintaining innovation and customer trust?
I do. So, not from our industry, but one of the biggest Canadian examples of an organization that's done this is TELUS, right? So, I really love TELUS. They do a lot of great work in the data field, and they're the first Canadian organization to achieve ISO certification for their use of generative AI. So they have a very robust policy and set of procedures and standards for working with generative AI, where all of the data that goes into their generative AI models is fully obfuscated and removed of any PII or PI, to use the Canadian terms. So what that means is that they're now able to open up the use of generative AI to their partners, such as within TELUS Health, in a way which, their partners can be confident working with the technology, knowing that any information they put into those tools is not going to be used to retrain models and become public IP.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, it's scary, right? Especially in healthcare.
Yeah, especially in healthcare.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oof. Okay, well, that can be another topic under the under health.
Yeah, exactly.
Not under CRIN. We'll talk about, I'll introduce you to somebody else. Anyway, the one last question, Dean, before we close this off, and
Yeah.
what tools or technologies do you recommend for managing data privacy, AI oversight, and cybersecurity compliance?
Okay, that's a great question, Anne. So this is a rapidly evolving space. If I look at kind of the big cloud service providers, so the big three, AWS, Azure, and GCP, they've really been focused on the technology, right? So, phenomenally, these solutions can scale massively, right? You can build AI models that can power solutions like what Netflix and Amazon use, right, on these platforms. Where they've fallen behind, I would say, is enabling this technology to be adopted in more regulated fields where artificial intelligence and working with data is not our core competency, right? So for a firm like Netflix, data is your core competency, right? Like your recommendation engine is at the heart of your business. For our businesses, it's an adjunct to make us more efficient, unlock new revenue streams, ensure that we're compliant. So I would say, you need to look beyond those big three cloud providers for a lot of this. Microsoft's been making some great advances. And look at tools like Elation, like Calibra, that are moving more now into not only data governance, but also AI governance. And what you get there is you get an off-the-shelf platform, which is usually cheaper than building stuff yourself, which has all of the right steps, all the right processes, the right policies baked into it that can save you an awful lot of time and can plug into the cloud service providers to guide you through the workflows to work with data appropriately. So they can really accelerate your deployment. You can, of course, do this without technology. You can, run a lot of these processes through spreadsheets, but then let's say you need to be able to prove to let's say a third-party partner that provided you demographic data for a certain purpose, that you used it for that purpose. Having a single pane of glass, which binds the use agreement with where the data was ingested within your business, and then everywhere it was used throughout the business and the models that were built off the back of it, that's going to be very challenging without one of these off-the-shelf tools.
So do you think there's a technology gap somewhere that still needs to be developed?
There is 100%, but it's rapidly closing. So Calibra, they released their AI governance module, which is designed to address the artificial intelligence, the AIDA, the artificial intelligence portion of Bill C-27. They released that, I want to say, about 12 to 6 months ago. And then we're on the first to market, but I expect a lot of the other big governance providers will shortly follow suit.
Wow. Lots of things to digest today. I know you said it's boring, but you know what? It's extremely important to understand, right? So
I think so, yeah.
yeah, I think so too. That's why I asked you to come today. So
Thank you.
thank you very much, Dean. A really, really informative hour. And we've already gone through an hour, believe it or not. We're at 12:25 and we're closing off in about 4 minutes. Does anybody else have another question? Anything online?
Thank you. I do have another question. When we're talking about technology tools, there's so many new offerings coming on to support oil and gas companies to collect more data in a robust way. What would you want to see in a data governance strategy that would help companies manage the different data sets on all of these different tools that are very specific for one purpose or application?
Great question, Carly. So there's a few different things there. There's contractual protections, right? So let's say you're working with a tool which is a software as a service. Where do they store their data? What protections do they have in place to ensure that their data is well protected? The second thing that I'd really look at is kind of any predictive models that they use. What validations can they provide you to show you that those models are ethical and in accordance with how that data was collected? And the third thing is, I talked about tools such as Calibra, which will allow you to have that single pane of glass for where you've got data being ingested into your organization. You're binding it with the policy or the contract, which defines the terms for which that data can be used. And then you're showing the lineage of here's where the data was ingested, here's the business units that used it, here is how they used it, these are the outputs they created. Having that single pane of glass that binds all this together and creates that audit trail is also something that I would really look for when working with third-party data providers and solution providers.
Phyllis. Thank you.
My pleasure.
So before we wrap up, it would be remiss if I didn't talk about our next event, May 21st. We've got Fortinet coming in talking about cybersecurity. So there's a cybersecurity expert. They're local and they're going to talk and dig in more into C26 or Bill C26 and the impact that will have on industry. So I'm looking forward to that one. I saw the presentation earlier this week and it's going to be a very fulsome conversation. Secondly, if you're not a CRIN member, I need to make an advertisement and say, become a member of CRIN. There is a QR code here on the bottom of the screen if you're not a member. And if not, just go to the cleanresourceinnovationnetwork.com website and become a member through there. So I'm going to give you a use case as to why I became a CRIN member. Actually, I'm going to use case for something recent that happened for me. Leveraged the network to connect to someone at National Research Council. And so we needed to connect to someone who had put together this patent and connected with one of the CRIN team members. And then within 48 hours connected with the person that's responsible for that IP through NRC. And then had a meeting with all the stakeholders within a week. And now that's created a long-term relationship and conversation with the NRC and the company I was with. So that's the network at play. And that's what we are, is a network of networks. Leverage it. So May 21st, CRIN membership. That should be it. And thank you very much for joining us today in person and online. We have lots of food left over for those who want to grab some extra food before you go away. And thank you again, Dean. Very, very, very informative day. Even though you said it was boring, I was riveted. And hopefully all those online are too. So thank you very much. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.